I think the question of deplatforming, this is one of the central issues of our time that's really overlooked and it's underappreciated. So many people on both sides are in favor of this when it's somebody they don't like, right?
Yes.
The central issue is this. Do we want companies deciding what can and cannot be said? Do we want governments deciding what can and cannot be said? If the answer is yes, it is a very different kind of society than we have had traditionally. I do think we need to understand where this impulse came from, how it came to be, and why it seemed reasonable. And a lot of people forget this. And it came from ISIS. If you remember, the Islamic State was all over YouTube, they were all over Twitter, they were all over Facebook, and they were literally burning people alive in cages. They were beheading people, pushing people off buildings, just horrible stuff. And that raises a tough question for a lot of these companies. Now, it's very easy to make the argument that, all right, this is a direct call for violence. This is literally supporting terrorism. And as a private company, we have no obligation to let people use our platforms. Therefore, we're closing their accounts, right? We're shutting this off. We're erasing it. We can do whatever we want. It's our website. Don't like it, leave. Constitutionally, there's no freedom of speech issue implicated there because the Constitution restrains the federal government and the state governments in certain circumstances. Not private companies. But once that precedent had been established, that they would do this for ISIS, they started going, well, what about these other people? What about these things that could be construed as calls to violence? Okay, what if they're not violence at all? What if it's harassment? What if it's abuse? What if it's racism? What if it's, criminality? What if it's drug culture? What if it's pornography? What if it's whatever? And there will always be more what ifs. And the categories of prohibited speech will constantly expand. So we need to ask ourselves, well, who is best placed to make those decisions about what can and cannot be said? Traditionally, the access to broadcast was limited. You had radio, you had TV. If you didn't have that, you had the soapbox on the corner, right? Or the local university, the coffee shop. And somebody owned those places, or somebody ran those places. The college president would say this person would be invited to speak, this person wouldn't be invited to speak. And I actually think it's right and proper for people to be able to protest speakers, to say this person shouldn't speak at our college. But I think the college itself, the institution, has to be willing to make value judgments about why they invite certain people to speak. And if that person's a very unpopular speaker, if that person is representing a viewpoint that is not well supported by the college, if it's not necessarily what students want to hear, but the administration believes, like the faculty believes, that it's something students should hear, isn't that why we have universities? We don't go to class to learn, necessarily, like, you don't go to a literature course to read the things that you want to read. You just go home and read those yourself. You go to study a curriculum to something else. You want to benefit from the experience from the perspectives of others. The question that people have is, how does this expand into the wider audience, right? What happens when you move beyond universities? What happens when you move to news broadcasts? What happens when you move to the internet? What happens when everyone everywhere can broadcast? And this is where I think things get really tricky. Not can people say what they want? As long as they're not advocating violence or whatever, I don't think this should be a difficult issue. But this gets complicated when you have things like YouTube's next video suggestion algorithm. Because the idea of universal speech, universal ability to broadcast, is exactly as you said. Well, what is the counter for this? You've got freaking Nazis on the internet. And I'm not talking like whatever, the guy's got a Trump sticker on his truck. I'm talking goose-stepping, swastika-bearing, actual freaking Nazi. You have those people out there on the internet calling for violence, calling for all these terrible things. And normally the way you deal with this, even in the case of something like ISIS, you drag them onto the platform. You discredit their ideas before the world, because if you don't, if you drive them underground, if you make them, this faction that's, hanging out at a radical mosque, or, they're hanging out at the hardware store if they're freaking Nazis or whatever. There are places where you create its own community that is sheltered from other perspectives, it's sheltered from other ideas, and that is where extremism thrives.